The Right Church, From a Seeker to a Finder, written by Peter Hoover of Ontario, Canada, in the late 1970s, published in 2021 by Metamorphose Publishing of Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, USA. Chapter 12 of 16. Perspective. What next? On one hand, I respected and sometimes admired my parents' gracious hospitality, so consistently willing, so enthused about reaching out to any Tom, Dick, and Harry as the needs arose. But how much, I asked Nellie, while milking on a Saturday evening in April, have we actually accomplished? We have so little to offer. It would take a very strange person to decide to ever join our crumbling, old-order congregation here in Dorchester. So why do we take in people like Roseanne? A blind, or deaf, or mentally impaired person might even like it here. Nellie tried to be funny, but I was not amused. Roseanne, I told her, is definitely none of the above. She needs spiritual help, and how can we give her anything? She's more liable to get help from almost anyone, anywhere, than from us. As poorly as the conversation had begun, I wished to discuss with Nellie what we got ourselves into time after time by taking in people like Roseanne, the troubled daughter of Eldon and Darlene Shirk. Eldon, our local milk truck driver, had gone to school with Dad and his whole family long before my time, had also belonged to our old order congregation. He still considered Dad a good friend, even though the Shirks and a good number of others like them had gotten born again, rebaptized, this time by immersion, and joined the Plymouth Brethren. Now they attended the Barnesdale Gospel Chapel in the suburbs of St. Catharines. Unfortunately, things had not gone so well with the next generation of those converted ex-Mennonite families. Eldon Shirk's oldest son, Ralph, had pitched his Christianity away, along with the last of his cultural trappings, and was now an agnostic. Their next child, Roseanne, had signed up at the Prairie Bible Institute in Three Hills, Alberta, but had gotten unstuck as well and needed help on almost all levels. To get her back to shape, her parents, to my amazement, had asked Mom and Dad to take her in, at least for a while. Maybe at your place, out on the farm without bad influences and TV, Eldon had told Dad, our daughter might regain her bearings. As if we had discovered our own, I told Nellie later. I wonder why Mom and Dad keep thinking they can accept all sorts of people in need when we have so many needs of our own. We have nothing to offer. That's not true, Nellie objected. We can share the love of God just as easy as anyone else. Just look and think of who all has spent time with us in the last few years. Jacques from Quebec, our Sri Lankan friends, all those international students from the Gulf Agricultural College, Bob and Lucy, the scientists studying wolves, Ehud and Uzi, those guys from Israel, Jorgen Krayberg from Norway, the schoolteacher Bronwyn from Australia, Nigel Davis from southern Rhodesia, all our German friends like Heinrich and Lisbeth. I could go on and on. Surely they have carried one small blessing, one nugget of truth back to where they came from, don't you think? Perhaps, I said, but just carrying a blessing is hardly changing lives. Look at all the unhappy misfits that we have taken in, like Jesse Rora, or the folk that Peter Voss keeps bringing from the House of Friendship. Remember Fred Grader, or Edwin Dietner? Nellie, popping cups onto the next cow, found it funny. Oh, sure, Fred kept licking his thick glasses to clear them, and Edwin had lice. At least Bertha was sure he did by his scratching. She trailed him wherever he sat or stood with her disinfect spray. It wasn't so funny back then, I told her, but you're missing the point. I would love to belong to a Christian fellowship that would have something to offer, a place where we could lead people into and where they might be helped. As it is, I get the feeling we need help just as badly as they do. More soberly, Nellie agreed. Are you thinking of something like the Society of Friends, perhaps? Or your MB friends? I'm not sure, I told her, but we need something better to offer than what we've got. I would love to get baptized into something that I could throw my life into, something fulfilling, enriching, a fellowship that would not be too hard to get into and yet be serious, following Christ for real, not just talking about him. Wow, Nellie looked at me appreciatively as we walked in together from the barn. I hope you find it, and in the meanwhile, maybe I shall need to try harder to actually make friends with Roseanne. She seems really hard to connect with. I feel for you, I told her, and promptly, after washing up, found my way upstairs to read my latest book, The Gulag Archipelago, by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I was already on the last chapter, the fattest book I had ever read, and I found it disturbing. It belonged to Norman. He was all full of scary things about communism, nuclear war, government conspiracies, and the like. To me, the book pointed to something else. The oppressive, dangerous, and corruptive influence of mind-bending systems, tightly controlled, yet dysfunctional, and often decrepit societies that keep people in spiritual bondage all of their lives. What were the parallels between that and what remained of the plain churches of North and South America? I tossed that about in my mind and kept on reading until I finished the book. Quite a feat, only I winced when I saw the time when I switched out the light. Not exactly the hour that Dad expected us to see on Saturday night. Would I manage to stay awake next morning at the worship meeting? I hoped so. Thankfully, on Lord's Day mornings, we did not make a big deal out of breakfasts and family devotions. As soon as we got in from chores, we were free to grab what there was and head for the shower. I was pleased, though, to see that Nellie was paying special attention to Roseanne. A slow, somewhat bewildered person, she could easily try someone's patience. Dad had required her to wear dresses at her house, but she still spent forever brushing her afro, funny that a shirt could have one, or polishing her nails. Nellie invited her to help with the dishes and tried to keep her oriented. Mom found it exasperating. We managed to glide into the parking area at the meeting house just in time, nevertheless, and noticed that an unfamiliar car stood parked under the maples. The morning sun streamed against the east side of the little white meeting house. Before too long, I noticed, I would need to come with the bush hog to trim the patches of early growing grass. "Looks like we even beat Uncle Lorne and Aunt Clara," Nellie remarked when she joined the girls on the porch. Lorne and Clara never had a family, so their reputation as the communal early birds had long become established, but I did not pay attention to what the girls had to say. Instead, I evaluated the unfamiliar car. It was a pinstriped black Camaro, with spiked wheels and fancy tires, decked out with everything its owner must have been able to think of. Wonder what Dad would say. Should I ask for a car like that? I mused. In the Kitchener area, I knew boys of our church owned sporty vehicles, and I suspected this vehicle came from there. I did not need to wonder long after the door slowly opened on the driver's side to reveal Ricky Frey, the bishop's grandson, with his girlfriend slithering out after him. "Of all things," I heard Nellie exclaim in a whisper. Bertha caught her breath. "Why, that used to be... that is Tammy Brubaker. I never knew they were dating." "If she needs to wear a purple dress with a pink sweater, why doesn't she complete the outfit with red covering strings?" Nellie giggled, but everyone pretended not to hear because the visitors were coming our way. "Hi, meet my friend Tam," Ricky introduced her, and I noticed the braces in her smile. Her dress just managed to cover her knees, while it seemed it must have taken a lot of skill to get so much of her hair outside of her head covering. Borderliners, I supposed. But the other couple that had by now also emerged from the vehicle seemed to be of the same sort. "We wanted to go to Niagara Falls," Ricky explained, "so we thought we should drop in for the service if there was one. Who's going to preach?" "I don't know," I told him, "but I see there's another car from your area. We better get in." This morning's minister, we discovered after the opening songs, was a man called Louis Cressman, and the text he chose was Romans 12. As soon as I heard that, I knew he would dwell on verse 2 in order to explain our entire old order, raison d'etre, nonconformity to the world. I was not disappointed. Our job as Christians, our calling in society, the preacher informed us, is to provide the brakes to society. No, it does not mean that we never make changes, or that we reject all modern inventions, like the use of electricity, or telephones, or tractors, or cars. Once anything is well established and understood, We do gradually use what worldly people invent and produce. But we as Christians should never be the first ones to jump into things. We should be the cautious ones, the last ones to jump onto the bandwagon. That is what the Lord did, and that is how he expects us to follow him. For once, our visiting preacher had caught my attention, fair and square, not because I agreed to anything he was saying, but pretty much because I so strongly objected to his whole philosophy of life. The very idea, I fumed inwardly, is the Christian life nothing more than slowing down the drift? Who cares, I asked myself, how fast or how slow we travel down the Niagara? Sooner or later, we'll get to the falls. Who cares how we do it? Everyone that gets to the falls will fall in the same way, straight into disaster. Looking around at my home congregation, I asked myself again, how long must I stay? How long must I put up with this nonsense? I wished I could pray about this matter, but I didn't know for sure how to start. We don't really mind using modern things, Lewis Cressman continued. We just don't want to be the first ones trying stuff, the risky ones. And I'm not just talking about material things, I'm also talking about nonconformity in a spiritual sense. We should not be the first ones exploring all kinds of revivals or new ways of doing things. There's no sense in changing our traditions or practices just to have something different or exciting. The apostles started the church, and I am totally satisfied with what they started. I am deeply thankful to the Lord that I, as a Mennonite, can build church on the one foundation that Menno Simons talked about all the time. He always put that scripture on the title page of all his books. Inwardly, I felt like grabbing my black Sunday morning hat and waving it for all to see. You think the apostles wore these? Or that they belonged to the Old Order faction? Just picture the Apostle Peter cruising about with a black Lincoln Continental and his wife properly attired in black covering strings. Good try, Brother Lewis, but please think a bit longer before you speak. Smiling benevolently at us young people, Lewis concluded his sermon with another scripture from Paul. We need to learn how to use this world's things while not abusing them. I have no problem at all using a car, but I would not feel comfortable with anything other than a black one, a conservative one, and I feel the same way about our clothes. They don't have to be, for instance, as extreme as the Amish or the Tunkers, but they should still be distinctive, uniform, just like we have agreed to wear them, and the same applies to everything. We use education, but we should not send our children to college. We do not need higher education. The world gets along just fine without us. Our calling is not to be smart, but to be humble, nonconformed, real fools in the eyes of the world. According to Paul, it takes a certain amount of ignorance to stay on the narrow way. Talk about getting one's foot in one's mouth. I looked over at Dad and wondered how he processed all this information. For so many years he had faithfully defended the old order way, but he also had enough common sense, I thought, to see how flaky the whole thing had become. Just putting on the brakes. What kind of brakes? Our church had already broken its crankshaft, its tires were flat, and our gas tank had shown empty for years, spiritually speaking. When the last strains of the song had died out and the benediction approached, we promptly grabbed our wraps and left. I approached Ricky Frey outside the door before he could leave to start his car. You're surely coming to our place for lunch, right? The two of us had known each other since childhood, but today Ricky did not seem quite himself. Well, I guess maybe not, he answered apologetically. The others decided they would like to eat in the Skylon Tower at the falls. By now, Tammy and the other couple, Dennis Burkhart and Lori Clemmer, had appeared, and he followed them to his new car. Maybe some other time, he called back over his shoulder. I watched the car pick up speed and rapidly disappear into the urban sprawl. Everyone getting into our own car, especially Dad, was somewhat taken aback when I told them of the young people's plans. What are the folk at Niagara supposed to think? Mom wondered. Plain people showing up in a stylish restaurant on Sunday? Fact is, Bertha said from the back seat, it doesn't matter what people think. It is what it is. And I am afraid that the few marks of separation these young people still carry, Dad continued, come through compulsion, not from conviction. Everyone looked at him. A rare occasion indeed to hear any criticism from Dad about the old order way. The remainder of the short way home was driven in silence, possibly because we had Roseanne with us. Once upstairs, I flopped down on my bed, feeling at the moment almost too tired or lazy to change and get ready for lunch. Picking up The Trail of the Black Walnut again, the story of the plain people in Ontario, I turned to the now familiar section of the Dorchester Mennonite settlement and tried to concentrate. Today, however, I was not in the mood of any reading. A soft breeze fanned at the curtains inside the open window, moving the pages of the calendar hanging on my wall. Wasn't this actually Palm Sunday? I reflected on the message we had just heard and wondered how to put all the pieces together. On the branches outside my window, the chirping of little robins mingled with the chorus of red-winged blackbirds down by the willows behind the barn. Spring had really sprung, and I pondered on the changes sure to follow. Our seeding was nearing completion. Soon the hay-making would start, while the women would pour their days into the garden, the orchard with all its cherries and currants and plums. Nature, as always, was taking its God-given course, 1978 speeding along. Would there be a 1979? A strange warm feeling rose in my chest when my thoughts turned to the future. In a few more years, I would be on my own. And then what? Would I be able to complete my education and get a real job? Not just planting begonias or milking cows? Would I be attending the Prince of Peace Church, perhaps, and come home only once in a while as a wayward son like Norman? What would happen with the family farm? I most certainly was going to inherit the Stoner place. Did I want it? Deep in my heart, I knew my answer well. The answer was a solid no. The future seemed great and real. Only a few more years, I told myself, and I shall leave this turmoil behind me for good. One thing certain, I'll never be an old order Mennonite hypocrite. Time to eat, John, a call echoed up the stairway, and I rose hastily to find my school clothes that I still wore instead of my suit on Sunday afternoons. Getting down to the kitchen, however, I was not prepared to meet the scene before me. There on the table stood the picnic basket, with Mom tying on her bonnet as if ready to leave. Bertha smiled at me. "We're having an old-fashioned picnic," she told me gaily. "We girls planned it all right after the meeting this morning. It's supposed to be a celebration of the fact that spring has arrived." Both Dad and Mom seemed jolly enough on the way down to Byers Cove, where we always had our picnics. Roseanne, who always came up with the strangest things, said, "Too bad I can't wear a hat. It just doesn't sit well on an afro." Dad looked back at her and grinned. Somehow, with this change of atmosphere, we young people felt almost like school kids, the girls rehearsing bygone picnic experiences with relish. For the time being, at least, our current problems seemed less onerous. At the park, the warm sun beat on the weathered tables of Byers Cove. The lake, vast and shining blue, sparkled on its dancing waves far out to the horizon. Uncle Dan and Aunt Jean, with their family, along with Grandpa Stoner, had already started unpacking their stuff, while Uncle Lorne pulled in, Aunt Clara holding a casserole on her lap. The women soon took off their coats, and Mom sat her bonnet down on a bench. With the meal spread out, we all stood in a circle to pray. Done eating, Leonard, Gordon, and I left our shoes on the sand, rolled up our pant legs, and stepped boldly into the still frigid incoming waves. A good try, but still far too cold to even dream of swimming, so we soon gave up and joined the others. Uncle Dan had brought along a stack of Grandpa's favorite oddly arranged songbook, the Philharmonia Sacra, half English, half German. All old order young people, they say, once sang from it every Sunday afternoon. I chose to sit beside Grandpa at one end of a picnic table. We had pushed several of them together. Gordon, exhausted after a stint on the monkey bars, plopped down beside me on the seat, and I thought I heard a little crack. Slowly, a mischievous smile spread over his face. He rose cautiously, picking up Mom's flattened bonnet, dangling it by its strings. Aunt Jean first noticed it. "Now, Gordon Sterneman," she shrieked, "how could you be so unobservant? Was that Iona's bonnet, the poor little thing? Now she'll have to go and get a new one made." "Not only that," Aunt Clara nodded, they're not cheap. No matter what, the damage was done. Mom graciously assured Gordon that it didn't really matter, as she needed a new bonnet anyway. I liked her for that. Pulling one of the songbooks over to him, Grandpa Stoner put on his glasses and began to find his favorites. In the meanwhile, Uncle Dan called for number 19, Bottom. I sort of enjoyed paging through the venerable book to read its outlandish titles and to see the bilingual verses. Sometimes Dad and Mom tried to sing some of the German ones at home, but it did not go the best. They were not the most accomplished singers around. The copy I held in my hands, I noticed, was produced by the Mennonite Publishing Company, Elkhart, Indiana, in 1875. I wondered what the Mennonite church must have been like in those days. When Grandpa settled on a song, Nellie looked at me and formed with her lips, number 118. I smiled, and just as she guessed, she was correct. Grandpa loved that song, and although his voice had become frail and he struggled for air, he sang it valiantly. Well may thy servants mourn, my God, the church's desolation. The state of Zion calls aloud for grief and lamentation. Once she was all alive to thee, and thousands were converted, but now a sad reverse we see, her glory is departed. A breeze moved the willows around us in the hazy light. Only a small group, a very small and shrinking group of old order Mennonites trying to keep the songs of Zion alive with all of Canada roaring around us. The words we sang, though, fit. Her pastors love to live at ease, they covet wealth and honor, and while they seek such things as these, they bring reproach upon her. Such worthless objects they pursue, warmly and undiverted. The church they lead and ruin too, her glory is departed. Her private members walk no more as Jesus Christ has taught them. Riches and fashion they adore, with these the world has bought them. The Christian name they still retain, absurdly and false-hearted, and while they in the church remain, her glory is departed. Out over the lake I saw two small boats, sailboats, miles from shore, bobbing on the water like gulls riding the waves. In my heart I resolved never to forget this moment at Byers Cove. And has religion left the church without a trace behind her? Where shall I go? Where shall I search that I once more may find her? Adieu, ye proud, ye light and gay, I'll seek the broken-hearted, who weep when they of Zion say, her glory is departed. Some few, like good Elijah, stand, while thousands have revolted, in earnest for the heavenly land, they never yet have halted. With such religion doth remain, for they are not perverted. Oh, may they all through them regain the glory that's departed. A little remnant, like Noah's family on the ark, with all the rest drowning around them. Thinking of that, being stuck in a boat, with nothing more than a handful of old order Mennonites, did not inspire me much. After finishing Grandpa's song, we knew it was time for chores. With a sense of reluctance, everyone rose to collect our things and go home. We'll have to do this more often, Aunt Jean called out to us from her rolled-down window as the Sternemans pulled out. The boys and Ruby waved to us from the back, and we returned the waves. The Lord only knows, remarked Dad. Then, glancing at Grandpa, he added, times are changing, and who knows how much longer our gatherings can continue in this way. Mom stared out over the lake, her crushed bonnet in her hand, but she did not answer. Grandpa planned to go home with us. It's too warm here in the barn, announced Nellie, appearing that Sunday night with a milking unit hanging from each hand. Heeding her suggestion, I stopped forking hay into the mangers to open the top halves of our two Dutch doors. Pretty soon we'll be fetching our cows from the pasture again, I remarked cheerfully. The days had become so much longer again that it was hardly necessary anymore to switch on the lights to milk. Who's taking Grandpa home tonight? I asked, but Nellie did not know. Would you like to? She asked later. I told her I had considered it, as Grandpa had promised to show me his family photos sometime, and tonight might be as good a time as ever. Nellie immediately got interested. "Can I go along?" she asked. "I have wanted to see those photos again for a long time." With extra energy, both of us hurried through chores to get everything done before supper. Grandpa at the table was in a talkative mood and helped himself to generous servings of chicken soup with nap dumplings, a Sunday evening favorite at our house. "Haven't had soup like this ever since Grandma did my cooking," he announced, but Mom only smiled. He said that every time he came to our place to eat home-cooked food. My thoughts turned to Grandma Stoner, who had died 5 years ago in June. The best grandma in all of Canada, I used to say. Cheerful, plump, and always lots of fun. Her candy tin was never empty, it seemed, and she told us fresh stories every time we met her. When my grandparents still lived in their little house in Dorchester, we kept seeing them all the time. Grandma babysitting us any half chance she had, and Grandpa coming to help us on the farm, but now all that had changed, drastically. Grandma's grave marker, a plain white slab with her name carved on it, had joined the rows upon rows of others like them behind our meeting house. Their house had long been sold. Dad's brother Wayne and his wife had lived in it for a while, but they had moved to British Columbia. Now a family from the Netherlands, Peter and Corey de Vries, lived there. When Grandma had reached the stage where she needed special care, she had insisted on being moved to an institution. "I won't plague Elias and Iona with my care," she had insisted. "They're not equipped for that, and neither are they medically inclined. We'll let the professionals do it. It's their business." Now with his companion gone, Grandpa Stoner lived in the Candlewood Lodge care home, alone. Alone in the crowd, as he described it. A stranger in the city, a farmer at heart. Of all my grandparents' 8 children, only my dad remained in the Dorchester area, also the only one left that had chosen the nonconformed old order way. A thinker, a writer, a poet. I could not help but feel for Grandpa while Nellie and I took him home. We left our truck at the parking lot and followed him into his apartment. Cozy in spite of its snazzy design, a homemade hooked rug lay on the white carpet before his antique china cabinet. Grandma's dishes. Last year's Christmas cards still on the wall. Grandpa's bed stood in an alcove, and he had pulled the drapes shut so we could no longer see his picture window facing the street. From a drawer, Grandpa pulled a shoebox of old photos that I had not seen for years. Nellie and I exchanged glances. We remembered it well, although we rarely saw it. Grandpa and Grandma had never used a photo album. It wasn't the old order way, at least not officially. A bit surprised, we now learned that Grandpa had added a good bit more to his collection after his sister Mabel, Arthur Teal's wife, had died. "This was my Aunt Lydia Hoover Kratz," began Grandpa, taking the photos out one by one. "She married my dad's brother Charles." I stared at the sober-faced lady in the carefully posed photo and marveled at its excellent quality. "People sure knew how to take pictures," I told him. "I wonder what cameras they used." "Oh, don't worry," Grandpa declared. "Just because we did not use modern technology like we do now, we had an eye for quality." "To be sure," Nellie agreed, as she scrutinized the photo herself. Carefully, I passed the photos on. One stiff, elaborate pose after another. The young set in full Victorian finery, high, stiff collars and ties, girls with impossible hair, gorgeous skirts, and hats that looked like they might have weighed 10 pounds. Then came the plain ones, our relatives, obviously after their baptisms, in full-fledged, nonconformed garb. Nellie kept giggling and commenting. "They sure took themselves seriously," she said. Perhaps, I agreed, but I wonder what they were actually thinking. They were humans just like us. They faced all the struggles and challenges we do. For over an hour, we were engrossed with the photos, laughing at the stern expressions of some and the likable manner of others. Most of our relatives, we concluded, must have been old order Mennonites, but Grandpa corrected us. Through all of this, he had not said much, but when the last picture had returned to its box, he laid back in his rocker, folded up his glasses, and took a drink. We watched him expectantly, knowing that a story was coming. "No," he began, "most of your relatives whose pictures you saw tonight were not of the old order. The majority of these photos were taken around the turn of the century, well after the church division of 1889. From the Stoner family, only my father, Isaac, and my Aunt Rebecca, Simon Dawson's wife, went with the old order faction. Did I ever tell you about the Mennonite church division?" Grandpa's eyes had taken on a faraway look as he fingered his cane laying across his lap. We told him that we had only heard fragments of the story, so he, after some deliberation, rocking gently, proceeded. The trouble here in the Dorchester congregation came to a head during the spiritual revivals that stirred the Mennonite Church of Ontario throughout the 1880s, Grandpa began. Sunday schools were introduced in many congregations after visiting evangelists from the States, such as Daniel Brenneman and John Kaufman, came in to hold a series of revival meetings. Then Daniel High, a preacher from here, started holding midweek prayer meetings like Alan Miller's people still do. These innovations met with strong opposition from the conservative minority. They thought the church was merely conforming itself to the world, so they insisted on keeping things just how they were. Nellie and I had often listened to Grandpa Stoner telling us things, but never before had he talked to us as adults about this. Unfortunately, Grandpa continued, those ministers who favored the revivals soon classed the conservatives as being legalistic, dead formalists, and like the Pharisees, too traditional in every way. In the spring of 1889, a major division split all of our churches here in Ontario, the majority remaining with the conference, while nearly a third of the members were put out and became what we call the Old Order. Grandpa paused, but since neither of us had anything to say, he kept on going. In our congregation, the percentage was exactly 50-50. 9 families stayed with the conference, while 9 formed our Old Order congregation. Ever since then, the meeting house has been shared by the two groups. Surprised, I asked, "Why then aren't there more Mennonites here today? Alan Miller's congregation currently includes only 6 or 7 families, and ours only 3. Grandpa gave me a long look. "There has been something wrong with the Mennonite church for a long, long time," he answered. "In fact, there was something wrong with us long before we even came to Canada." Both of us were surprised now. I had always pictured our pioneers as real saints who had braved the trials for conscience sake, but Grandpa kept on talking, so I could not interrupt. "We lost our first love, still back in Germany and Switzerland," he said. "We got so involved with our church activities, our current situations, that we lost our connection with Christ, the inner light of His Spirit. Once that happened, we lost our bearings. We focused on things that were not important, while we ignored and neglected what we should have done." "Like the children of Israel?" I ventured. "Yes," Grandpa agreed, "or like the church of Laodicea. Once we lose our connection with God, the Bible no longer speaks to us. It just becomes a dead collection of letters and words." I believed what Grandpa was saying. I knew it took inner connection with God to walk successfully as a Christian, but was I a faithful, triumphant example of that? Off and on, perhaps. "You never saw my dad," Grandpa continued, "but I am sure you have heard of him. Peter Stoner. He encountered God as a young man in a remarkable way." I had never heard this story and perked up to listen. Peter Stoner, long before he was my dad, had a keen ear for music and loved to dance. In fact, he had become well known for his skill with the violin, and all the young people in the Dorchester area counted on him for their dances. One snowy night, however, before he stepped into Art McCallum's place, our neighbor's, he peeked into the window. The dance was already on. He recognized all the local youth and knew full well what they were after. Nothing but carnal pleasures and sin. He saw the lot as dancing devils en route to everlasting destruction. Nellie glanced at me. Was she making comparisons between this and our connection with the MB youth right now? I hoped not. "What my dad did then," Grandpa continued, "was to run straight back home, smash his fiddle, throwing it into the fire, and asked for baptism. Like I said, he was one of the very few of his large family to keep to the narrow way. he chose to be an old order Mennonite. I had figured out by now where Grandpa was heading with this. Just another dire warning, another admission to stay with the plain and simple way, the only way to be saved. But I was mistaken. Grandpa asked me a question. What do you think turned my dad around, sending him in an opposite direction? A complete turnaround? I wasn't sure. What happened, Grandpa said, was that the Spirit of God spoke to him, just like he spoke to Daniel in Babylon, or to David who became a king, or to Paul, the young man who had set out to destroy the first Christian church. Paul had been a zealous follower of the Bible. He thought he had it all together until, out of the blue, God spoke to him. He listened to God, and his life changed. Do you know what it sounds like when God speaks to you? Nellie and I found this question a bit disconcerting. Well, not exactly, I finally stammered. I have some ideas, but I'm not always sure if they come from God or not. It is not hard, Grandpa told us. God is not any remote old man with a long beard sitting light years away on a chair. God is spirit. No one has ever seen him. Jesus said so. Instead, he is here, right now. He is everywhere at the same time. All of creation operates on his command. All we need to do is to listen, to follow his instructions and go where he tells us to go. I wish it were that simple, Nellie exclaimed. I have long wished I could get some personal instructions straight from him. It is that simple, Grandpa declared. Just try it. Listen to God, and he will tell you every day, all day long, what to do next, how to accomplish it, or what might come out of it. God's ideas and instructions will pop up in your mind if you allow him access. Only one thing. If God suggests things, you better listen at once. Take the cue. The more carefully and promptly you obey God, the easier it will get to know what he expects of you. I loved Grandpa for talking to us like this. It made sense. But if things are this easy, I wondered out loud, why is our church the way it is? Why are we doing so poorly in keeping our people together, let alone bringing new people in? Every time a believer or any Christian group ignores God's directions, Grandpa explained, the light goes out. One cannot choose to ignore God's voice and get by with it. If we brush his warnings away and do our own thing in our own human way, God lets us sit. I am afraid, Grandpa's face showed pain. That is exactly what has happened with us Mennonites, already in Europe, but all the more so here in North America. Too many of us have just shrugged off the voice of God and followed our own ideas and obeyed our own laws, just like the Pharisees in Jesus' time. And you thought that problem started already in Europe? I asked. In the beginning of the Anabaptist movement, Grandpa said, it cost much to follow Christ, same as it was in the Apostles' time. We didn't have it all figured out, but at least we were earnest. We loved one another, and we listened to God. As my favorite song in the Philharmonia says, thousands were converted, and out of that love and unity came local churches, one after the next, popping up here and there like mushrooms. But in a few years, the fire of the revival, connection with God, waned, and when famine struck, thousands of us destitute Anabaptists joined the Lutherans and the Swiss Reformed in a mass emigration to this new world, to Pennsylvania. Here we settled down to farm, to make money, and live in peace at all costs. Mentally, I reviewed the photos we had just been looking at. Smug, prosperous, well-situated, folk thinking we had everything together because we still had a few signs of nonconformity, or else we were into revivals and missions. Only about 50 years after the main trek to Pennsylvania, Grandpa continued, a wave of Canada fever swept through our communities. We feared the new American government after the Revolutionary War, and of course we had our eyes open for cheap, fertile land, so we joined the United Empire Loyalists to Upper Canada. I glanced at the mantel clock standing on Grandpa's china cabinet and noticed that it was already 9:30. Soon I knew we had to leave, for Grandpa was not supposed to be up late. You both confess faith in Christ? He changed the subject, right? Nellie answered with a yes, and I nodded. But neither of you are baptized, Grandpa continued. You are both old enough for that, and I presume you recognize the importance of water baptism. But to tell you the truth, I am thankful that neither of you have joined the church yet. Grandpa smiled at our puzzled looks. From what I see of the old order, both here and elsewhere, we are no closer to listening to God or following his directions than Alan Miller's congregation, or the Russian Mennonites, or what is left of the Tunkers, or anyone else. For many decades we have had an unfruitful church experience here at Dorchester, and I do not think God even expects us to save a sinking ship. Out in the hallway, a nurse marched briskly by, carrying a tray of bedtime snacks and apple juice. The situation indeed may appear to be hopeless, and we may think that all the odds are against us, stated Grandpa, but my prayer for you, young ones, is that you latch on to God, and if you hang on tight, you will surely find a church growing up around you again. With God's help, you can do a much better job than we did. Don't trust any sacred heritage, trust God. And if you catch on how to listen to him, you may well do what the first Christians did right at the beginning, 2,000 years ago. I had lots to think about. Grandpa rose, propping himself on his cane, and reached up to the shelf behind him. Here, take this with you, he told me. It's just a storybook, but it made a real impact on me, especially because it appeared right in the thick of World War II. It gave me a fresh insight into the faith we profess and the real church, the universal church into which we belong to. The Robe by Lloyd Douglas. I studied the cover of the book while thanking Grandpa warmly for it. Nellie did the same. Like me, she also loved reading. A nurse appeared for the second time in the open doorway, this time to remind us, kindly, that Grandpa needs to get to bed. I wondered what all she might have caught in our somewhat unusual conversation. After clasping Grandpa's hand, wishing him the best, and telling him good night, we walked silently down the empty corridors to find the truck outside. Quite the stories tonight, Nellie stated, thoughtfully, as we left the city behind. I did not respond, too busy with my own thoughts. Far out, I saw a pale moon hanging low above the dark, moving waters.